Hang on, are we live? I'm confused.
It says live on my end, yeah.
All right, so we are live. Hi. I wasn't sure. So this is Chrisiosity. Coming here today with my friend John, who runs the YouTube channel Ontical Philosophy Forum, and talks a lot about philosophy online and different things of that nature. So I thought he was a good person to come on and talk about the topic I kind of wanted to talk about today, which is there are a lot of people who will say things like we shouldn't talk about Trump. Trump is a distraction from more important things, or that there's no point in talking about Russian collusion when nobody's actually going to impeach him, because that's just the way that the power structures in our country are working with us right now, or not working. So I just thought that that would be a good thing. You want to say hello to everybody?
Okay. Yeah, I'm John. As you said, I run the Ontical Philosophy Forum YouTube channel, which covers mostly philosophy, like say, mostly within the critical school. Also, some people refer to that as the continental school. And basically that's composed up of a number of European philosophers who were deeply inspired by Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud. And basically the philosophy that I deal with is pretty much in response to those philosophers, as well as a couple from the Enlightenment as well. But there's also not just philosophy that I talk about, but also like politics and economics and how they relate to philosophical problems as well. So yeah, Trump is an interesting one. But the first thing that I'd say is regards not talking about Trump and not challenging him, just because he's probably never going to be impeached. One good reason for why I don't think impeachment would go through is because of who his second in command is. It's a bit like the Cheney-Bush sort of dynamic, like Bush was terrible, but nobody wants Cheney either, and so we don't want Trump, but I'm pretty sure that Pence would. I'm pretty sure that he'd probably be worse than Trump, in a lot of respects, but because he's so outright religious fundamentalist, whereas Trump is a bit ambiguous on that. Trump's one of those, like, he gives a silent nod to everybody. He'll do something, and it's never spoken out loud what he wants the setup to be. For instance, moving an embassy into Israel. It's like a silent nod, and all the way through his election campaign, there was all these silent nods to white supremacists and anti-black, anti-Mexican narratives. It's the things that he doesn't say that speak the loudest, and also how he just doesn't pay any lip service to grander international problems. And he's got this. I was just going through the Wikipedia article just to refresh my memory on what has been happening over the past few years, and he signs a hell of a lot of executive orders, constantly, one after the other. And the first one that he does is the gag rule order, which was if you're not funded by the United States government to assist with like abortion and family planning, and you're not from the States, then you're breaking the law effectively if you're trying to provide awareness about abortion or provide abortions or family planning. And so the first thing that he attacks, just like any other sort of proto-fascist dictator, but let's just call him a capitalist at least, the first thing that they do is they seize the means of production, the production line, and one of the most crucial role of that production line are women who produce the labour force. And there's a great writer, Silvia Federici. She's an Italian Marxist feminist. I mentioned her in Claudia's video, and she shows that all the way through history, in the formation of capitalism and the way that it switches over from feudalism to capitalism, wherever there was like pockets of resistance and women who refused to have children because they knew that it would just lead instantly to exploitation, that the dynamic wasn't right. They saw the exploitation because, believe it or not, capitalism was a weird and wonderful idea when it first came about. It seemed very strange to people. But as soon as they started with this antenatal movement, shall we say, the state pretty much just, legalizes rape and encloses not only people on the land and what they can, farm with and provide for themselves, but they also enclose the body as well. So it's interesting that Trump, the very first executive order that he does, still follows that historical pattern of controlling the womb, of controlling the woman's, going straight for the woman's body in terms of abortion.
That's also interesting in terms of, I mentioned that we were going to talk before we get into the Trump part about just a couple of quick solidarity call out things. And both of them, I think you can sort of see how they sort of play into that. So the first people that I definitely wanted to call out with solidarity are the people who, the feminists in Saudi Arabia who've been arrested. And these are mostly women. I think 7 out of 10 of them are women. And Can I get you to, if you're ticking on your keyboard, to just mute, because I don't know, I just find it distracting.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
No problem.
Yeah. Okay.
But some of them are 7 out of 10 of them are women. They are longtime feminists. Some of them are 60, 70 years old. Some of them are professors in colleges. And so what had happened is, as you know, the prince there, whose name I'm going to forget because I can't remember names for anything, but the prince who has been trying to sort of finagle political points, and he has done this at least in part by saying, well, we're going to give women the right to drive. And at the same time that he said that, he said to the people out there, I don't want anybody talking about this. This is going to be me. This is going to be all about how wonderful I am and modernizing and good for women. And the people, who've been out there trying to get this literally for decades said, well, okay, if that's what it's going to take to get this done, then go ahead, have a parade. They didn't. But then, of course, the big contradiction there is he wants to get this, but he wants absolute patriarchal control over his country. And I mean patriarchy in the most literal possible
extreme sense
way, right? So they put forward.
Is it Prince Mohammed bin Salman? Is that the yeah? Okay.
I believe so. So
yeah.
Thank you for having names. So they put forward that they wanted a shelter for victims of domestic violence. And the next thing you know, they're all in jail. So they're all in jail, possibly facing 20 years.
And the death penalty as well.
And the death penalty. So this is a really, and this, of course, comes after, in that country, it's completely, it's just illegal to disagree with or criticize their monarchy, their sort of theocratic monarchistic system that they have. So that's why I mean it's the most literal patriarchy you can think about. So and it's you can't criticize them, you can't demonstrate against them, you can't agitate. And so there's been a number of these things, and it's just sort of coming to the head. So so I just wanted to sort of throw that out there as one. I don't know if there was anything you wanted to say about that before I go into the.
Well, I think that basically what the women in that country are saying, that if they can drive, it helps them to enter the workforce, and of course the Saudis don't want that, you know. So it's because I was mentioning just before we come on the air about you know, the notion of primitive accumulation, which is how you basically divide up the classes in your society, and how you want the way in which, you know, capital or whatever your political economy is, you know, he's clearly setting it up in a way where, you know, women will always be the subjugated class, like second class citizens, and any move against that is, you know, they'll just come down on them with force. And this is, yeah, as regards it in terms of, they got like an absolute monarchy, a really powerful monarchy over there, basically a theocracy really, as well, which you know, confuses things when people talk about how to get out of these problems, because you get like, you know, religion mixing with race, patriarchy, and capital, you know, and they all revolve around the way in which that primitive accumulation is sort of set up before the society is running in full force. And so we can end up with these clouded discussions about religion, or, you know, what people think are the root problems to get rid of. And the truth is that they're all sort of interdependent on each other, and they've been there for such a long time. And the longer that they're there, you know, the harder it is to sort of envisage an outside of those structures that are in place. But this is a country that, you know, that exports a lot of fuels and, you know, oils, and it's generated a lot of money that way with the international community, with Britain, with the States, and various other more, say, developed countries, consuming countries, and they're like a producing country, but it's heavily unequal. It's very top heavy, and there's pockets of resistance, but as you say, as soon as they sort of come out in the open, they want to change things for the better. Revolution is then, you know, met with counter revolution in no time at all. So it's very hard to sort of dismantle those ways in which they act with one another. And, you know, this is what happens if things are left to just get out of control, and nobody talks about things and, you know, gets involved. You know, this can happen anywhere, you know, if you just think it's normal, you know, and that's the problem why it gets so much pace as well, is that it's not just, you know, straight from the top. It requires a kind of accommodation all the way through society for these things to take place.
Yeah. Well, those are all good points. So I'm going to go on to the next one,
Okay.
which we're switching back, coming back to America, and something like 10 women from 9 different states have come together to sue McDonald's for sexual harassment.
Okay.
They are being, it is the $15 an hour groups. The, oh God, now I'm going to forget the name of that group. Does anybody in the chat know? Something for 15. rate for 15 or pay for 15.
Just now looking it up. So,
Yeah.
huh.
And at the same time,
Oh,
it's
right, here it is. We've got workers in several US cities sue McDonald's
fight for
over sexual
15.
harassment.
Thank
Right.
you. I knew
Yeah,
you
there you go. Fight for $15. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Chad. You saved me. um, and it's being paid for by Time's Up, which is so I'm glad to see it. I'm glad to see sort of the labor and the fighting for and the sexual harassment Me Too, Time's Up kind of people coming together, because I've been saying for a long time that we have something that is as much a labor movement as it is as well as a woman's movement. So these women, and this is the second time they tried. The first time McDonald's said they were going to look into things, and nothing happened. And so now they're back, and there are more of them. And what they're saying is, here they are with their whopping $8.25 an hour part-time work, and they're being harassed, they're being grabbed, they're being treated very badly, and then if they come forward, they get laughed at, like literally just laughed at or shined on, or in some cases retaliated against by people who just could give a shit. So, and McDonald's has this, it's a game really that they play where they're a franchise. So when something like this happens, all of a sudden McDonald's is, we can't help what every little franchise does, and so they've done that. They've played that game to block unions. They've played that game to block.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Like
I used to work for a fast food place as a delivery driver, Domino's Pizza. And the bigger the front, I worked for one that was just the two guys owned this one store, and they were on the floor with you all the time, and it was actually quite a nice place to work, because you had there wasn't that what I'd call the pathos of distance between you and the employees and the employer. They'd be there on the shop floor with you, and they wouldn't be afraid of you, and and you wouldn't distrust them. But as soon as I went to work for this other one, the same franchise but a different owner, he owns about 14 at least across the entire UK. You don't see him. It's all very fixed. There's no chance of a pay rise or anything. And they were even so strict about if, say, you wanted a reference for another job, this would especially impact those who just left school, for instance.
right.
They wouldn't provide references because they said that they might get sued if you do something wrong, which is just absolute garbage, because it's just an opinion. It's not like written in law that Domino's knows everything about my psychology, or but yeah, those sort of the way in which you know that you're just being used when you're there, and the attitudes of people, and especially female workers as well, the women workers, they would certainly be having a hard time there, and it's always like you're at the bottom, and that's that, and when you feel that way, like you were saying in this particular case, it sort of weakens your body, and you end up sort of accommodating quite harmful norms, things that are just normal. It's just another day at work, and you just want to get through it, and you just don't stand up and be counted, and that atmosphere certainly sort of is there to drive a wedge into any kind of unionization. speaking out is just you moaning or whatever, you could just leave and get another job. That's their attitude. And it really is a good thing to stand up to franchises in particular, because they really can, and they can end up putting in some like managers and supervisors who they really do think that they're like God or something, and their attitude sucks. So yeah, it's good to stand up to them, because if you leave it to their internal disputes, they never do anything. You have to take it out somewhere. So it's good that somebody has come forward to help them as well, and finally we might start seeing some of this volunteerism that's supposed to be going on when you've got a capitalist society where you just help people out because you want to, but it's very rare. You have to really make a noise for that to happen, so. And
I'm sort of stealing this line from somebody that I don't remember who it is, but the whole volunteerism idea is very unethical to me, because at no point in a society should, whether or not people receive the things that they have a right to, or the sort of standards of living, should be dependent on the whims of whether or not people with the money feel like doing something today. That is like, we all have to sit and wait for Rosie O'Donnell to decide that we're worthy. Like, that's just not how it should work.
Well, yeah, I mean, charities are fundamentally just private companies anyway. So, it's very difficult to, as you say, you can't just hang back and wait for somebody to have, I don't know, a Ebenezer Scrooge moment, to have that Christmas Carol moment, and then finally start to help people out. Charity is a bit of a con, because it's basically saying that it is somebody else's problem. When it comes to the state, the state should be taking care of a number of things that charity seems to pick up the pieces with, and charity ends up being an excuse, particularly within, like, say, a liberalist sort of idea of how an economic political economic system should be run. By liberal, I mean, like neoliberal, and not so much like left leaning, but one that too heavily relies on putting good faith just in allowing the market to just sort it all out, which to me is completely irrational from the get-go. That if we are supposed to be human beings who are rational and making our own choices, leaving it to an irrational factor, which is the market, which isn't so predictable sometimes because of things like collective action problems, where individuals all act on their own self-interest, and this causes the whole thing to sort of come to a halt, like trade deaths. So it's very something that's worthy of being aware of, in the myths that we have about who should help who and why, because it ends up being more about inequality as some kind of virtuous thing. Everyone's getting what they deserve rather than what they need, and those who get what they need and want, are just more about those who can afford it. And so again, that primitive accumulation is just sort of sitting there in the background, being covered up by a number of other issues. But really what's going on is that, like, people are just viewed in a hierarchical sense based on their status, and that status is usually equated with who's got what, who's accumulated what amount of stuff. And so yeah, it's very difficult for minimum wage workers in these big chains to be noticed.
Right. So that's good. And is there anything else you wanted to bring up before we move on to the main topic?
I think we could just go straight into it. That's fine. Yeah, just sort of taking it steady and try not to put too much in there that would be too overwhelming. Seeing as it's like a first chat, and I want people get to know what I talk about in a in a slower sort of way. Just steady.
All right. Well, so now I would argue that regardless of whether or not we think it's going to result in Trump being taken out of office, I think it's important to talk about it. It's important to sort of talk about, even if all we're doing is saying, look at how broken we are, because in any rational system, this guy would be impeached, and he's not being impeached. And I'm listing to you the reasons he should be impeached so that people know we're broken. Like,
Yeah,
this is broken.
yeah. Well, I was going to say something before we moved on to this, but it's relevant here. But like, when it comes to free choice, being rational subjects or whatever, turns out that like the choices that we have aren't so good. So really, there is no rational actor in the society as it is, because you don't really get to freely choose. You get like limited options, and someone like Trump, I mean, he's going to be in here for like another 2 years, and the more he does, that's utterly sort of depressing is the least that I think you could summarize it as. People are just sort of counting the days for him to go, but how much of that will stay behind as a legacy independent of him is a concern. And Trump, you can ignore him all you want, but and you might say, like you were saying earlier, there might be he's a distraction from other problems that might be worth paying more attention to. But it's like trying to ignore an earthquake, really. I mean, this guy will say anything for attention. He completely undermines the judiciary and the legislature by tweeting on Twitter and starting all sorts of problems there, and signing really aggressive executive orders and what have you that are like I mean, to some degree, how much control does Trump have here? Is he really, is he just some lightning rod, to for somebody else who's advising him, or is the symbol? Either way, the impacts are going to be felt all the way through society, and especially towards us. There's the potential where he might start to try to undermine our national health service, and the treatments and important medications might be too expensive on the system, and our politicians in the UK, seem to be quite weak and might be in a position where they might be susceptible to make silly deals with someone like Trump. But yeah, it's
Well, this was, and this goes back to before he was even elected. I had put out a video about him where I sort of argued that people who are in the United States have a special moral obligation to keep people like Trump out of office, because, it's unfortunate. Whoever becomes our president has a serious global impact, right? And that's just the way it is. They're going to be felt around the globe, and maybe for the next 100 years. You don't know. But the whole globe doesn't get to vote for him.
yeah.
They don't necessarily get a say. So that's why I sort of argued that people who are in America have a sort of special civic obligation. First of all, their basic civic obligation, which is to be involved and educated as much as they can be, as much as time and
Yeah,
their
to
opposition.
anticipate. Yeah, to
Right.
anticipate what he's going to do, and yeah.
Yeah, and to anticipate what they're going to do for our own country and what we're going to do for our own
Mm.
citizens, and also for other people too, because they exist. We can't just
Mm.
we like the environment is going to be, what he's doing for the environment isn't going to be like, well, don't worry if you're in a different country, that's not going to be a problem for you because it's only our country that has decided that we don't need to sign this treaty. And it doesn't work like that.
No, it's a globalist world. We're all linked together in what you could call a global village now. There isn't that distance between us like there was before this new media, which has a kind of life of its own now, it would seem. Um, but Trump is someone who fits the description of some of the philosophy that I look at is called accelerationism, which is the phase in late capitalism where everyone just sort of surrenders and lets the state operations and someone like Trump, who's basically a CEO, run government affairs, and instead of opening up pockets of resistance that are against the state to bring out radical change, the idea is that you just accelerate them and you develop the capacities of that state to the point where they basically implode on themselves, but it's never going to be a pretty sight when that happens, because there's going to be a climate disaster and, basically just turning the earth into a giant lump of coal just for us in the process. And that seems more and more normal as it goes along, and producing countries will just become more and more exploited by big companies like ExxonMobil, or and the banks are running riot, being deregulated. So Trump seems to fit that potential danger of someone who would be at the forefront of at least getting the ball rolling with something like acceleration, which is a massive concern, because it's almost like people at the top of the capitalists, the ones with the power here, almost have a kind of what you could call a view as if they've got a vitalism about them, a kind of, so if you try and protest and say, you're ruining the planet, stop doing that, that's such a dick thing to do, they won't respond with reason, whereby it's like, oh, we've got evidence to show that this isn't the case. It's more, you are blocking my vital force to take this capitalist dream to its extremes, and to be the best that I can be, a hyper individual, while ignoring all these other social factors and other people in general, in this kind of blocked off exceptionalist view of themselves and the world. And it's strange to see someone like Trump at this stage in history, in this time. It's almost like the time is out of joint. It's surreal. It's like hyper real. We all know underneath that something's gone horribly wrong here, but we're just trying to do our best to sort of get through it and try and make the best of it. But certainly, he's somebody who needs to be critiqued and constantly held to account, even if he isn't impeached. The best of a bad situation is to hold him to account. He is in a position where he can be held to account, and he has been met with a lot of resistance from like the Senate and things as well. And so our government, our right-wing government, the Tories, have been met with a lot of blockages from like the House of Lords for silly decisions. So it just seems like there's a massive incompetent politicians out there at the moment, more than ever before, and it's it's either going to be a good thing where the system just becomes so pointless and nihilistic that it sort of defeats itself, because it just becomes so like irrelevant from real affairs in the world in general, or it can could get out of hand. But either way, people need to interact with it definitely, and to deal with it.
I mean, I am sensitive to the idea of, well, maybe this is how it's going down, like this is how the system is, this is how our democracy ends, not with a bang.
It's like that's it. Out with a bang. Yeah.
But on the other hand, and if that's the way it goes, it's, oh God, is it going to be bloody? God, is it going to be bad? And so we have to to acknowledge that. I think we have to acknowledge, and I think this relates to something somebody in the chat said, oh, algae. I hope I'm not insulting you. Is it a good reason not to arrest a mafia boss if the next in line would be an even worse mafia boss? And I think there's an argument for saying, even if you knew that mafia boss would be worse, you still, if you're upholding the rule of law, and
for sure,
if the good guys, if you're trying to at least say, that we're still, however of a mess we've made of things before, we're still at least on that level. Like we haven't,
I mean, what I was saying earlier in regards to well, you'd have Trump, you'd have Pence to deal with if you got rid of Trump. It's certainly if someone's doing an act which is a harm, then they should be held accountable to the law, and it doesn't matter who comes in next. But like I say, it's set up that way. It's a tactical ordering of the office, that makes one a bit hesitant to get rid of someone like Trump if they know that someone like Pence is next in line. But certainly that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and impeach him if you can, if he's done something that you can hold them to account for, and they've done something wrong, and the same would go for his second in line. Sure.
And he certainly has. I mean, I think it's absurd at this point to say that he has not done things which amount to obstruction, misuse of power, and various things like that. There's just been so much. He's so unethical, and his practices are unethical, and his decision not to divest himself from his own holdings has caused so many just reverberating. Nobody knows anymore when they hear he's going there, he's talking to this leader, if he's looking for for the American people, or if he's just looking to make another Trump hotel somewhere 5 years from now. It doesn't. It's
for sure. There's
absurdity.
It's got like a blatantness to him that other politicians don't have, and that makes him sort of an unknown variable kind of thing. Very unpredictable and volatile. And people don't like those things. They like certainty, and and that. But then again, they are some of the reasons why dictators and fascists get in, because they seem to have this very blunt, that's it, we're going to take action, they're the bad guys over there, they are the others, and we're just going to build walls, but we're not going to build bridges, we're going to build walls, and we're going to I mean, he hasn't even fulfilled some of his campaign promises, whereby he was saying that he was going to tax companies that imported goods into the US if they're from the States and they're outsourcing. But he's done no such thing. In fact, he's like lowered the tariffs on those imports. So like straight away there, he's done nothing to protect jobs there. And a lot of the things that he's taking credit for are just what would have been happening if Obama or Hillary was in power anyway. You don't see the effects of a campaign, whoever's in office until like, at least say like 3 or 4 years onwards,
Yeah.
So it's again, he's such an unknown variable, because it's like normally with a politician, they got like a legacy and they stick to a way of acting that's been seen before, a culture of action that's seen in another president or someone else in office. But Trump just does everything he can to just be sort of relentlessly sort of blatant. For instance, another one of the very early executive orders was that of stripping away all the red tape when it comes to manufacturing in the US, like for the pipelines and things like that, which to the working man who just wants a job and things like that, it all sounds great, but that red tape's there for some pretty good reasons, and it was being stalled before for environmental reasons. But he just come in and he just said, "I don't give a shit. I'm just going to take away these regulations which are there to protect the environment, just for the sake of so people can have some jobs and they can vote me in again." So again, it's just the motives are the same as like the Tories over here. They hold a referendum just so that they can stay in power.
Yeah.
And on such a massive question, and the question was such a silly question. Not to really bring the topic over into the UK, but it seems to be that what I've been talking about throughout the whole of this is how, in a way, there's just this massive incompetency of right-wing politicians at the moment, in your country and ours. But like the question shouldn't have been like stay in or exit the EU. It should have been something more like, do you want capitalism or do you want socialism? Do you want access to the common market or not? Whereas like the damage that you've got from previous years, like Trump is sort of the effect of everything that's been building up for years and years and years. Ignorance, expensive education and tuition. You haven't got an educated populace, which I believe directly affects the state of democracy, because you can't make informed choices if you're not aware, if you haven't studied enough political cycles, for instance, or you're not aware of certain key terms and histories that affect us to the present day. And there's a weird sort of double standard when it comes to the advocation of Trump, and that is all these negative things in the past regarding race and patriarchy, and the things that have historically materialized. They're said to be irrelevant, but then all of a sudden the reaction to want to go back to a mindset that was in the 1930s and the 1950s, when it just seems to fit in with those sort of social conservative values. All of a sudden they're allowed to like come back to life to bring us a kind of out of joint scenario where everyone's got to be put back in their place, and that was when things were great, when it was all predictable, and but it's with Trump I think it's more that he is an unknown variable and kind of explosive, and so people want him gone for those reasons. And I think that it's hard to get back to business as usual after all the warnings that have been given for the past decade or so. This Trump is the outcome of the kinds of economic and political and social problems that we see everywhere, for the past, at least since the last financial crisis, the last big crash. It's sort of been really brewing since then, since 2008. And before Trump got into power, I was seeing a lot of stuff, the rise of the right coming from some very unexpected places. Like, I think I mentioned it in Claudia's video, some new age stuff, like amongst hippies and things like that. They were all listening.
Very strange to me.
They were supposed to be really like spiritual and left leaning and stuff like that, and bring about peace and the age of Aquarius or whatever. And then next minute they were voting Trump, and it was like, how did that happen? But it's because they were all listening to Red Ice Radio and all these disingenuous channels that definitely had the backing from people who were in Trump's office or associated in a decentralized way, in a way that's very hard to sort of link it up. But they were certainly, given a lot of money to target audiences and to get them used to certain ways of thinking and ways of speaking and certain keywords. And then when the more outrageous stuff comes about, Trump comes along, here I am, and, build the wall, get Mexico to pay for it, and all the other outrageous things that he says. All of a sudden that didn't seem so strange, because just before that we had a massive outbreak of flat earthers and Holocaust deniers everywhere, and that even got into the media. A rapper, I can't remember his name, probably because he's so insignificant, but he was like voicing a lot of the flat earth stuff, and Neil deGrasse Tyson responded to him on the TV. So the really crazy stuff that was coming out of the darkest corners of the net spilled over into the media, and Trump seemed to be very well informed of how to talk to these people, and that was
Bannon was
weird.
Brilliant for that. Like Fannin, and I'm going to try to remember this all off the top of my head, which means I might say something that's not perfectly 100% right. But Fannin had done one of these companies, and what they do is they he'd have guys in, I don't know, Korea or someplace working on farming in World of Warcraft 16 hours a day, and then selling to people, right? So people were buying this sort of virtual stuff online. Well, this sort of ran afoul of people who are online a lot, playing WoW, and they were mad that, people could come in and sort of cheat the system by going this route. So they went after his company, and they really messed it up. But his takeaway was, we have a lot of young men out there with nothing to do. And a lot of anger.
I mean, what else could you take from that? It's just glaring you in the face. So,
like, I can there's a gun, and I can probably point that gun someplace I want it to. So, so it's very, and that's one of the reasons that, as much as I don't make much of an impact online, I think the left has to start, fighting this sort of game of talking to people on YouTube and on social media and things, because right now what we have is all of the Koch brothers are just funding the crap out of YouTube channels and Ruben, and then I believe it was it RJ who in the chat who was saying talking about the links between even Turning Point USA, that awful Charlie Kirk person who, like, every time he comes on, I think of him in a diaper now. He needs to never done that. That was the worst ever. Well, he was, quote unquote, triggering the libs.
Right.
So,
of course.
Yeah. But in any event, yeah, there are these sort of links between right-wing power and YouTube channels that are putting out slick, well-produced, financially covered things, and the left has nothing. We have nothing really to sort of
well, it's
because everybody's on their own. Everybody's gonna build it from the ground up. And it's not that easy as if you have.
What the right has got is because they push something particularly towards like capitalism, people love it so much, that they love opinions to be voiced, and they want to pay people to express those opinions, and that's something called clientelism, which funnily enough is a tactic of what you could summarize the mafia as being, really. As we mentioned the mafia earlier, a lot of people sort of understand it as this kind of working class uprising, and they like in a kind of meritocratic sense, but that's really not the case. They were the strong arm of the aristocracy, and one of the ways in which they got even more support and power was to ensure that people voted for particular parties, and that would give them the confidence from those above to enact the policies of the mafia through whoever's in power, so that they ensure that people would be voting for whoever said that is going to back them and perform their task. Same thing goes for like the Camorra in Naples and the 'Ndrangheta as well, which is like another sort of mafia gang. But it's the same sort of principle. A Patreon is a kind of form of clientelism, and left-wing ideas just don't seem to generate it because, well, for one, a lot of people who are probably left-wing, probably don't have a lot of money, and that's probably one of the reasons why that they're left-wing. So it's whereas like the right has people with interests in high positions of power and advantageous positions in power, so they can just pour that money in there. But I'm sure there's a few channels that have seen their bank accounts decrease in cash a lot since these parties have gotten their way, and that distance has been put there again. And it's, to me, I've never seen such blatant exploitation. I've never seen such blatant that people are being used to sound off these opinions as if they're their own, and they don't even know that they're just being used, that they'll be discarded at the very last second. And that's what never makes any sense for somebody like Donald Trump or any kind of fascist capitalist method of action in political economy, is that there is no regard for the other, as we were saying earlier. And the question I always ask is, well, if those people in power who you're advocating, all of a sudden turn around and turn the tables on you, and you end up in that deprived and shitty situation that you're imposing on others, I seriously doubt that the people who are advocating what Trump stands for, they wouldn't stand for it. They just wouldn't. And that's the problem with it. It eats itself inwards. It sort of implodes on itself after a while. Because you constantly need somebody to blame, and that's whereas it's better if you can get a wider understanding of what causes a problem like Trump. And one of those problems is like a sort of non-linear warfare. It's a very rampant campaign that's out there. People who are supporting Trump sort of sometimes unwittingly, sometimes just because they follow a particular pundit who they'll never disagree with, and somehow that got infiltrated. I think Alex Jones is probably the most blatant one that you could say is like that. He's got tons and tons of followers, and then all of a sudden he's got Donald Trump in an interview just before the campaign started and what have you. And after all that noise about corporate corruption, there he is asking Trump how he's going to invade all these countries and get the minerals and things like that. And there was a few YouTubers that I used to watch. One of them was an Irish artist, Thomas Sheridan. He was into like the occult and things like that, and he just sort of changed overnight. One night, he went from saying that Alex Jones interview was beyond shameful, and that Alex Jones fans should be ashamed of themselves, and they're perpetuating all this advocation and promotion of Trump, and it's doing nothing but go against everything that they're supposed to stand for, to then all of a sudden advocating for Trump like overnight like that, and because it looks like a profitable thing to do, and that's the thing, the right have been so popular online because it's the only place where really they can talk and that they will be heard, because we've got no choice to bloody listen to them because they're making so much noise, whereas normally those sort of opinions would be pushed out the way. And I think like Sean and Jen put it quite well as soon as all this stuff started to happen, is that Trump has just normalized those ways of talking and thinking, and it's okay to be openly racist, and you don't have to hide those things. And every day I interact online and you see people sighing their sighs of relief that they've been sighing for years, because they only listen to people who voice those opinions that they want to hear. They're not really thinking about the way things go down. I think when we were in that interaction on Twitter a few months ago, about the stealthing thing, is it rape or sexual assault or what? That was a good example there. I mean, it was just endless like opinionation. You can't, even if you just make your position clear, they don't listen to you. They just don't listen to you. They just want to shout at you. They just go round and round in circles to the point where you just mute them because they're entertaining themselves. They're just screaming at the screen, screaming at the tweets. They don't see the other person. And like you were saying, it's all individuated, and they seem to be much more united because they just appeal to the lowest common denominators. But if you actually start to try and challenge the mainstream authoritarian establishment views, you tend to be unpopular. It's difficult to get people behind you. And a lot of the time, a few like left-wing activists probably don't even have Facebook accounts or YouTube accounts, because they don't see it as a place to that does any benefit, that they've got things that they can do face to face with people.
I think that's a big thing. And there's somebody here, and I want to actually address his question. It's P-Dog Knight asked, is it possible we just don't resonate with people? Of course we don't resonate with everybody, but there's a lot more than that going on. And I mentioned, the money being poured into these things, and these are people who have been, they used to be tobacco lobbyists and oil company lobbyists, and now they're funding Prager University. Like, that's not an accident. Those
no.
linkages are not, they didn't just come up. So there are people out there looking to see how YouTube is going, and to sort of turn it into a place where these sorts of opinions, because these sorts of opinions are so not mainstream and they're unacceptable in the mainstream. And so what we had for a long time, when it was like 10 TV channels maybe, and a couple of radio channels, is there were, because it was limited, right? You had this sort of, and you have standards and practices. Like, you can't go on, go and decide that I want to be on a TV show on prime time, and I'm going to do the Count Dankula Pug bit. Like, that wasn't a thing. Like, there was nowhere for that to exist, except in very niche, small kinds of places. So when that,
or you get like a hotline where you can call in occasionally, but that was few and far between,
Yeah, but now literally anybody can do it.
It's infinite, yeah.
And there is no control, and there's no real possibility of control. Now, I've been waiting. I'm not even monetized, and it's been weeks. And they tell me it's pending, and I meet all the criteria. I exceed all the criteria that they have. I have no strikes. I have no copyright issues on my channel. Like, my channel's in good standing after 2 years. But they're just, no, it's pending. So there's no chance of me making money, except to sort of go out and say, can people do this and can people do that? I also want to say, and this is an observation between what I have seen from left wing and right wing. Now, and you can say, because this is going to definitely come across as judgmental, and it is. Like, I am judging.
Okay.
So this is, I'm not going to be nice about this. It is, when something happened, some little thing would happen. Let's say, there was some woman gets yelly at a college. You had this fabric of 300 different channels making the same fucking video about it.
Yeah, I noticed that, yeah.
And not only are they making the same video about it, but they're all watching them. Like, I struggle to make sure that I'm actually watching left people, like, because a lot of times they're telling me something I already know, so I don't watch that. But
if you usually agree with them anyway, then
like, if they put out something that's sort of basic about feminism, I have this problem with let's say Jody Sinead, I believe her name. Online, and she does great sort of feminism 101 videos that I always mean to watch. I always I should watch that. And never sort of get around to it, because I don't want to watch something 97 times over. I don't want to watch I don't want to watch some yelling college person 57 times and hear 57 different people talk about how awful and culturally Marxist that is. Like, the fact that this is doing a thing, it's pointing out that there is a hunger for a certain kind of content, but it's also pointing out that there's something wrong with it. Like, there's something wrong with, and I'm sorry to say it, there's something not quite, if you are so hungry to hear about this and to have this narrative validated, that you would watch 5 different videos on the same damn
Yeah.
thing, saying the same thing. Like they're not saying it's, when a lot of times people will come out and now eventually I've got like a, something in the work about the Day for Freedom and Count Dankula, but I'm hoping to sort of take it into a different place than other people
Yeah,
have.
that sounds good. Yeah, yeah. That's what I try to do mostly. That's why I approach from the point of view of philosophy, because it gives you real philosophy to me gives you a really good outside perspective that's not going to, just bounce off the everyday doxer, or not doxer as in someone disclosing your point of view, but like just everyday opinions. That people have, so like that's one reason why I think I tend to go to philosophy. And another important factor of it for me is having a kind of beginner's mind approach to things. So I will go back and look at the more basic stuff just to refresh my memory, because half the time I'm actually surprised at how much I can sort of forget. And usually the simplest points from like 101 are usually like, really important. But yeah, there's a definite I think that the critique of the medium is the thing that I think is missing. There's one very important philosopher, a Canadian philosopher, called Marshall McLuhan, and he wrote a book called Understanding Media, and he basically talks about media at the time of his writing. He was writing about the TV and the radio, and how that has an effect upon the audience. That there's a sort of active process going on there, and how it's eventually he had a very sort of contra view to what everyone else had at the time, which was all this development of networks and media is going to lead to the human being like super rational and really intelligent, and it's all in the name of growth and progress, and it's all going to be great. But his argument was that the easier that you make the information to obtain, it actually makes people dumber, because like when he wants to find something out at the time of his writing, he'd have to go to several libraries and send off on a mailing list for certain research documents and things like that we can probably now get at like the click of a couple of mouse clicks. And it just makes people sort of lazier and less determined in his view.
There was a book that came out, I want to say it was called something like The Death of the Expert or The Death of Expertise. And I don't think it's necessarily that it makes people dumber, but it gives people a real boost in their Dunning-Kruger spaces, right? Like that all of a sudden, because you have access to a scientific paper, you think you're a person who should be evaluating that scientific paper. Like you think you're all of a sudden, because you can look up and get some statistics online, you don't feel like you need to listen to people who have spent 10 years studying and interacting with those statistics. And you're not appreciating that. Like 30 seconds on Google, 8 years on in school. What's the difference? But there is a difference, and that's not, I think that's not being appreciated.
So this is Tom Nichols' The Death of Expertise. Is that the book? Yeah. So there's a quote that I've got for it here that I've just got up. These are dangerous times. Never have so many people had access to so much knowledge, and yet been so resistant to learning anything. So I think that's a good way of summarizing what's going on there, what you just said. So it's there's all the bad habits, I think, as well, that people have got from sensationalist media. Instead of coming to it with like, I'm gonna make videos that aren't for my audience. You know, they're not really, that's not the first thing that I'm thinking of when I make a video. I'm making it for me, for clarification, for me to, you know, put something together in a visual way where I can make something complicated make sense to me, you know, because it's a new way of writing, I suppose. It's a new kind of you know, it's not like speech as we know it, where it's live and it's present. It's sort of suspended in the air, and you know, you can change your point of view on it. You know, the first time that you watch it or the second time that you watch it, and it's a very strange experience, like being a creator on YouTube, because you know there's a certain level of self-awareness that it brings about you. You know, the way that you sound to other people, the way that you look to other people, and the more that people have become through the medium, they've become more sort of narcissistic in the sense that they're putting their self-image out there, and that image is being reflected back to them. But as much as they are shaping the medium by interacting with it, the medium is like a tool that shapes us in return. So there's like a sort of narcissistic feedback, and eventually what is your own self-image is out there in the world. It's a part of the culture, it's a part of the medium, and we don't recognize it as being, you know, kind of reflections of ourselves, and it takes on a kind of life of its own. And I think that a lot of YouTube creators would benefit a lot from leaving YouTube and having some time to reflect and to think about things, and to read more, and to, you know, I think like Sargon of Akkad would be a good example of somebody who's just, you know, let the medium envelop him completely, you know, and through.
Yeah, I don't even think that there's. I'm sorry to. I probably shouldn't be so dismissive, because I think it's a very good point, and I think there are a lot of people who actually could benefit from that. I think Sargon is one that I don't know what's happened in his head, but I don't think that that's going to work anymore.
It must do on some level, unless he's just equating what works with, you know, the accumulation of wealth and possessions, you know, in which case, yeah, it does. But as regards, I don't know, having a will to truth or some standards and principles that, you know, one can sleep at night with, you know, or either that, or he genuinely, you know, has absolutely no control over what's happening with him, you know, and that he's some product, a new product of the medium that's you know, a very bizarre sort of creature that can happen to you if you spend too much time on YouTube and Twitter or something, and being really, you know, hateful towards people. But like I got into him and Thunderfoot a few years ago, and it was after watching them, and then I think I came across some of Kevin Logan's videos, and then when I started to hear the opposition and understood the gravity of this massive argument that I was watching, I had no idea how huge it was. I'd never even heard of Anita Sarkeesian before I watched a Thunderfoot video. And the reason why I used to watch Thunderfoot to begin with was like the criticisms of creationism and things like that. So then, you know, you eventually stumble into it. And then I went away, and then I bought some books and read them. And then there was like Garrett and Go Fem Yourself, really great, who were really great YouTubers. Sadly, they've disappeared. And I think that their voice needs to be here. So, like Garrett in particular, you know, did some really great dissections of Sargon's misreadings of studies, and you know,
well, I mean, there's another channel where he talks about different things, but more like movies and media.
Yeah, I think I found it. Yeah, I found him on Facebook, and then I found that channel. Yeah, Well, it's a shame that the other channel isn't up. But yeah, I think again, it's like there needs to be more of a presence of the left, or in particular, I think more anarchists and philosophers as well. Like there's a new channel that was linked in Claudia's video, Cock Philosophy, and he's chosen the name ironically, but he's into philosophy, and he shows what's wrong with the things that like Jordan Peterson will say, and that he's being disingenuous about what he knows about the subjects that he's apparently criticizing. But really, again, he's just playing to lowest common denominators, which just seems to be those bad habits that have been brought to the medium. They haven't been reviewed. I mean, you only have to look at the way in which people string together their videos and montages and all the hype and the big Helvetica impact, so the impact font that you get on memes, that's plastered all over. They're just like newspaper headlines, tabloid headlines, the sort of stuff that you'll see in the Sport and the Daily Sun, and really really trashy sort of newspapers, and that propaganda is just like pelted out there constantly, and people are just perpetuating that automatically, like they're just, and that's something that I think needs to be reviewed, but it's very difficult to come up with constructive arguments and statements that are trying to educate people about their behavior and the way in which they respond responsibly in the world to others about certain issues, especially like really big subjects like feminism and economics and critiques of capitalism. It requires a specific sort of mindset that will be able to actually go and check these things out, and to only start being in discussions when one feels informed enough to get involved, and they know what the technical terms mean more. But what we can try and do is like construct these arguments, but it's really hard to put those across without people immediately being offended and not admitting to it. And it's very difficult to self-reflect if you're not willing to change your mind. And I think like Sean and Jen, he put it very well in that when he used to hold like kind of misogynistic points of view when he was a student, and he was on this forum that you had to pay for called Something Awful. And basically, if you got banned, you had to pay to get back in. So it gave him a good reason to keep quiet. And so he was in the forum, and he could see women talking about men and the way that they act and the way that they thought of those actions. He had to watch silently because it would be, it would cost him financially if he were to overreact. But that he said that this was all done in his own time, when he was on his own, without being jeered at publicly, or feeling like he'd have something to prove or to be defensive against, and he could sort of work through it in his own time. So it's about presenting those points of view and arguments and statements that can allow people to disconnect in that way, and then just sort of work through it in their own time. But it just seems that when it's done publicly, and this is where like I don't think YouTube has done many favors really to social awareness issues, in that that when all eyes are on you and things like that, it can be a very sort of distressing experience for people when somebody finally sort of confronts you with these opinions that you've held for all this time and never once been challenged. And the minute that you go on the internet, you're immediately confronted with people who disagree with you, and that's a very difficult thing to work through. And when you've got such a high turnover of young people coming onto the net, or people who aren't that experienced with interacting online. You know, it's that's always something new that's happening every day. And like in that discussion we were having on Twitter, after making it clear where I stood, you know, ethically, morally, whatever it is that you want to call it, in regards to how somebody should be dealt with and seen in the eyes of the law when it comes to sexual assault and rape and things like that, even though I made it clear where I stand on those things, within like over the course of about 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, they constantly ask me and confront me about you know, that point over and over. And all I could say is, I've already addressed that. That's already been answered 5 hours ago. You
Yeah.
know, like, what more do you want to hear? And that's, you know, there's only so many hours in the day that you've got to explain yourself to. You know, it reminds me of an episode of Red Dwarf called The Inquisitor. And basically they confront this cyborg who's traveled all the way through time. And he basically just deletes people from existence if he thinks that they're worthless. So it's like, you know, justify your existence, explain yourself. You know, that's a bit what it's like when you're interacting with people on Twitter a lot, you know, and then you get blocked or muted. And it is like literally like the Inquisitor thing, really. And then like the winner has deleted a version of history, you know, has changed the narrative of what happens in history by over exaggerating certain points, or, you know.
Well,
But
it's funny, and I'm gonna just jump in because something happened on Twitter yesterday that really just reminds me of this, because I'm anti-capitalist, but I was responding to somebody who isn't, who was talking about, you know, that there are brocialists out there, right? There are people out there who have a very heightened class consciousness and they haven't gone and sort of developed a consciousness of how these things play out with race and gender, and like you have when you're talking about, you know, the control of women and how that sort of relates. Or else they just assume that you know, once we get rid of capitalism, everything's going to be fine. Like where you have things like racism or sexism that aren't necessarily, they're being used by capitalism and even produced in our cultures by capitalism, but they don't need capitalism.
Yeah,
You know, there are other kinds of things that could perpetuate that. So, you know, she's making that point, and I was sort of agreeing with that point, that yeah, that's a problem, and it sort of takes people away, and it makes people just say, "Oh, fuck off," you know. If you're gonna sit here and mansplain to me about Marx and Engels, and then turn around and I'm gonna say, well, you know, let me tell you about my experiences as a woman, and they're like, oh, stop, I don't want identity politics, you know. So that is not a happy thing, and it's, you know, and I was merely agreeing with that point, that there's that problem exists in some places, right? And that was it. Right?
Yeah, well, it's
but people were jumping all over me, talking about my white feminism and my refusal to look at capitalism and the sort of structural things, and I'm just like,
they don't give you a chance, do they, to even begin to explain. They just assume and just lump you in with everybody else. You get blamed for the people who you're associated with these days, and it's just exhausting to overcome all those assumptions in a few sentences. So yeah, it's I cannot understand what I mean. There seems to have been a discussion that's been going on for, like, you know, since Trump got in power, and that is, we need more left wing people on YouTube, or, you know, people who can at least criticize capital adequately, you know, and understand that if we did get rid of capitalism tonight, we'd recreate it tomorrow. We might not be in the same form, you know. I mean, we can imagine types of capitalism without banks. We might have some without advertising, but fundamentally we would develop, a kind of a way of acting that's in terms of exchange and profit, and not so much about, gifts and use, and just finding what simpler ways of living that aren't so dependent on the market as this the thing that defines us all in our daily lives. But there are, of course, there are ways in which one can act that aren't capitalist as well, and I think it's important to try and emphasize those in ways that we can then begin to talk about alternatives and what's on the outside. And
I mean, we have to talk about how neoliberalism has overcome our personal relationships in ways that we don't see, right? Even our the sort of thing where we walk around acting, and this is something Peter Coffin talks about a lot, this concept that many people, and this is being definitely a factor on YouTube, where there's no oxygen between themselves and their brand, and they're always branding and they're always putting that out, and it becomes everyone is sort of using people, using the other person to get ahead and to sort of create drama, to create interest. Like, half of what you see going on is it's pure nonsense that's going on. It's just people sort of trying to recreate the Jerry Springer show.
Yeah, it's very superficial, and and that's what can just stem out of just seeing, in terms of a capitalist realist perspective, that competition just is the way things are, and that's the way that they should go down. And again, it's bringing sensationalism to a new media where it wasn't there before. We put it there. It wasn't, it certainly wasn't put there by any mainstream media outlets any more than they normally would do anyway. But Facebook's a funny one, because it brought all these people online who before Facebook, I always thought they'll never be on the internet. It's too geeky for them or whatever, or and it seems to have brought all this very diverse crowd of people onto YouTube and onto Facebook, and they're all ripe for producing these cultures and forms of life, and it's all very competitive and very heated. But as regards neoliberalism, I mean, one of the myths that it tries to sort of perpetuate is that we live in this sort of post society where we can develop things with the market, everyone gets what they deserve, and things like inequality and racism and patriarchy, those things will all iron out. We're all at the point where that's all sort of going out the way, while at the same time it's sort of sowing the seeds, the fundamental seeds that begin to create problems of intersectionality, inequality, and and it's very confusing, and it's it needs at least more of a presence. And to be honest with you, I think that people do a pretty good job on YouTube. I mean, I can find left-wing people out there. I can find people who talk about. I found a good channel today. I'll have to look it up on the iPad, and I'll send it to you via Twitter. That's well worth a look. But they seem to be on the ball and more sort of anarchist, and people who seem that they actually interact with the real world instead of just do a sort of token recording of them being outside in daylight instead of in the cellar all day, and just to show the patrons that they're getting what they pay for, or whatever, even if it's with an actor or whatever, to just sort of bounce off their opinions that they already want to hear. But like these guys seem to be, you know, they travel around a lot. They've been to Israel and Palestine, and you know, they've seen it firsthand, and they're all like really well read. I'll have to find out what it's called, but yeah, there are like it's what you search for, and I think that you can dominate the search results. That the war of the tags, you know, of hashtags, and you know, and the way that video suggestion algorithms work, you know, they can seriously manipulate people, you know, if they're not really that clued up on how they work, especially. And if you haven't got ad blockers and things like that, I mean, that was always a problem right from the start. You know, people would easily be deceived that they think that they've got a virus or something, but really it's just an ad that's tricking you into thinking that your computer's saying something that it isn't. But like that sort of lack of vigilance and having an eye for the way that the net works is something that I think has had a contributing factor to the way in which, you know, things have gotten out of hand. And you know, they're like, yeah, we've got all this great stuff and great technology out there and stuff, but it's still very new. We're still in like the testing phase of it, you know. And this is what some philosophers and cultural theorists like Nick Land and a guy called Curtis Yarvin, who goes by the blogger name Mencius Moldbug, they are two they talk a lot about acceleration, and they advocate that kind of neo-reactionary mindset, and they coin the term the Dark Enlightenment, and that is about like this new this new age that seems to have come out of the event of neoliberalism, people's confusion about how the crash happened, and then getting all sorts of like conspiracy stuff mixed up in there. And you know, he criticizes Alex Jones and Stefan Molyneux for what does he says that they've crackerized the right, you know, in his view. And these are right wingers, these are, you know, neo-reactionaries as well. But yeah, he's saying that they've put across this hideous message, and but they coined this term to say that this is like the opposite of what the Enlightenment is. That actually now we've got like, you know, a bunch of people who've got this new technology that they don't know what to do with, and the technology is taken over their self, if you will. It's the new. It's happened as a coincidence, like a surprise, and it's affected the, you know, the very structure of their mind and social interactions. And that's something that they speculate a lot about. And there's a series that I've been doing about Nick Land's book, which is called Fanged Noumena, which is to say like the abstract things in society, the things that are just like thoughts and what we think are just in the background. They're there like vampires that come to bite us in the night, and you know, they never go away. They're always there like a sort of phantom or ghost. And that's one way in which he sort of talks about a way in which we can't find a way out of our current states, because we're so like enveloped in them, in things that we just assume are given, and that they're just there, and you know, they're never questioned, these norms and customs, and how they have an effect on the way that we are.
And this does connect with what you were just saying. So I want to mention something that was in the chat. I won't call anybody out, but they were talking about, you know, how say marginalized people coming forward with their identity politics, quote unquote, concerns are confrontational, or can be seen as unnecessarily confrontational. And I think you have to look at the framing of all of that. I mean, unless you're used to going into leftist spaces and hearing everyone say, we all agree with each other, everything is wonderful. I'm not. Like, so you have to ask yourself why some concerns are confrontational, identity politics, and some are not considered that way. Some are not labeled as that, even though if you look at them, it's like, well, you know, why is that? And it's very easy when somebody is coming across to you to dismiss people who give you something you don't understand or have a personal thing to. So, for instance, somebody who was right wing had come to me and said, because I guess I had asked them to show me examples of people just coming at them with completely ridiculous things.
Okay.
Right. So they tweeted and they said, "Here's this trans woman, and she was saying, don't have to put a space between trans woman instead of just one
All
one
right.
word,
Okay.
trans woman."
Like yeah. Okay.
And isn't that stupid?
A
And
bit
I said,
grammar
well,
Nazi.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I don't know because I don't know why she asked you to do that. So I don't know if that's stupid. So it's
Yeah.
about, like you said, having a beginner's mind and not taking things to heart until you understand. And then, she came to me and she said, well, this is the argument. The argument is if you're saying trans woman and woman as two separate, distinct kinds of words, you're
Okay.
suggesting a trans woman is a different thing than a woman. Whereas if you just use it as sort of an adjective, like you would, pretty woman, smart woman, tall
Yeah.
woman,
Yeah.
trans
Yeah.
woman, and there's that gap in there. And she came out and said, this is a very small, minor thing. I didn't say people were evil and horrible because they were doing that. I just said this is something that can be useful. And since then, I've always tried to put the little space in there, and it's not that big a deal. But
Yeah.
people can be very defensive,
Mm.
right? And then their
For sure.
defensiveness becomes something that they blame you for. So you've just said,
Yeah.
this would be helpful to me, or this would be helpful to trans people if you could keep this in
Yeah.
mind. And you heard, you're the most horrible transphobic person that ever walked the earth, and we should beat the crap out of you every time you leave your house, right? Like somehow that is, and I suppose it's because nobody likes to be criticized, and the minute you start feeling that critique, like I've had Black feminists tell me, you're a white feminist, and it took a minute, and I had to breathe, and then I said, can you, if you don't mind, would you explain what you mean by that? Because in my head and in my heart, I don't want to be a white feminist. I don't want to have a shallow understanding of race and feminism. So if you can sort of hold that ouch, that first ouch that hurt, hold it for a second, take a breath, and then just sort of say, all right, this is something I need to know more about and to understand. And when
That's fair enough. Yeah.
So I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and I'm not going to say it's always going to work, or that people aren't going to come to you and say, let me tell you how many people have called me a fascist.
Yeah. Well, I can say that. Sorry, go on.
No, you go.
All right. I can say that I've been in a lot of trouble over, either from a misunderstanding about these issues, say surrounding trans in particular. One of them was regarding that very thing there about, you can say someone's a trans woman or a woman, and they prefer, this person preferred to be called a woman, to make no such distinction, which I thought was fair enough. But like I got into, because we were talking in terms of like philosophy, and a particular philosopher on gender called Judith Butler, who basically says that gender, in her reading, that you can look at gender not as something which is, a natural fact of nature, but something that happens out of acts, gestures, and it's performed and created. And so it can either be created by somebody else, in which case it can be sort of a dominant structure, or it can be created from the person themselves, and then you get a potentially infinite number of gender, and but basically a point is something about, it's not as fixed as it seems, and we might be able to live in a world where gender is not really a thing anymore. It's not part of our vocabulary in terms of defining ourselves, and that we can move beyond it. But she's also saying that if you're comfortable with being called man or woman or whatever, and you don't find it oppressive, then she's not asking you to give it up or anything like that. But the thing that this trans woman took issue with was that because it's saying that gender is created as such, it's almost like you're saying that it's forged and it's not real or something, that a construct is somehow not real. Whereas I look at it more as like they're repeated cultural acts. They're recognized not just by the person performing them, but the whole society. It's something that's like a convention, and conventions are real. The conventions are what we found the legal system upon. Language itself is all conventions. So anyway, this got, I got into, there was a bit of a disagreement, and things got heated, and sometimes it can be difficult to find that where people can calm down and what have you, and especially when it's something so like personal, like that person's going through it, and you're in a position where you're probably not able to see it from their point of view. Some people would call that either a lack of empathy or just plain privilege, whereby you just it doesn't necessarily mean that you're like a bad person. It's just that like there are some things that you're just not going to recognize that other people experience and what they go through, and that's part of the whole part of the understanding, but as out of that argument, and we've made up and we're friends again and stuff now, and everything, out of that, I got a few interesting insights about what gender is. I mean, the big question for me, there's a few videos on my channel are about that very question. There was a couple of response videos that I did to a guy called Daryl Sloan, who made the claim that transgenders are just like, it's just a manipulation of language and things like that, that it's you're tricking people, you're trying to be something you're not. And so I responded to that with a few of the things that I'd understood, not only from reading textbooks of feminism and from just from day-to-day stuff and talking about it, but also from this discussion and argument that I had with this trans woman as well, in that we can be talking about trans women who say that they're women, and that they've always been that way, and it's not like an awakening where 1 minute they were this and then they were this. They see it as they've always been this gender. And they make no such distinction like before between sex and gender either. Like, so that's where like some old theories of feminism sort of reach their limit, where normally people make a distinction between sex and gender, but like when it comes to to trans, because they want to align the physical body with and physical traits, genitalia, with the gender, they don't. They want to be referred to as woman or man, and so you end up with something that looks a bit like essentialism again, which is something that feminism is supposed to be sort of vigilant of, in that it's saying that that biological characteristics are one with gender, you know, that
Well,
genitalia is a man.
you're gender queer,
Yeah,
right? So I'm
yeah.
wondering how that experience sort of, does that experience inform any of this for you, or?
Well, for me, it's see again. It's like I find like gender a difficult one. See, for me, the performative theory of gender works for me. I'm sort of I'm someone who I've got like a mix of the way in which I'll sort of dress or act, you know, in a way where I don't think I see myself as one or the other gender really. It sort of sways from one to the other. But I understand that it's different for other people. You know, some people just don't experience gender at all. You know, they just don't see it. They don't see it as something separate from the way that they act because it's mostly aligned. And that's where you have to just say it's a spectrum. It varies. It's never going to be universal. You can't have just one way of explaining things. And I guess me being genderqueer, and that took me a while to figure that out, to find that word that would be probably the best way that I could describe it, where it's sort of, you know, my gender sort of sways from one day to the next, even to the point where I think I've even said that I'm agender sometimes, that it's without, that it's somehow I don't think it's adequate to describe things in terms of gender sometimes, but I think that having that will to know myself, you know, has led me to want to try and understand others and how they have varying different experiences, you know, and
I
perceptions of what gender is, and it's I find it fascinating, you know, to and also to look at it in terms of philosophy as well. You know, it's really interesting stuff, you know.
I I tend to think that there's a certain amount of ambiguity that we have to be accepting of in this topic because we haven't
Mm.
gotten everything figured out yet.
That's all. That's what the best answer. I think that was what I think I was trying to say
Yeah.
before, and what I've said to people is we don't know enough about it yet. You know, it's like,
Like it's still, and it's, I think people want the
mm,
answer. And I'm
yeah,
not even sure if we have the language to give it yet. Like I don't
mm,
even know
mm,
if
mm,
we've gotten that far that the right words are even
mm,
exist that would frame this reality,
mm, mm.
whatever you want to call it, in quite right. And I don't think that that's let's see, a question from a cis male: is gender static and just not defined well enough for you, or is gender dynamic and moving, do you think?
I'd say dynamic and moving. Really, it's literally just like spontaneous, really,
Mhm.
and not and but you know sometimes I wonder whether identity is something that I could call it, or whether it's really just desires and an action from desire, really, that I dress like a woman sometimes or like a man, not because it's making any statement about identity, but more just because I want to, in which case some people would probably just say that that's just like cross-dressing or whatever. But I don't know, it seems to have gone beyond that, is that like cross-dressing tends to be something more that's just like uh, done occasionally, or like I know a lot of cross-dressers who usually just do it indoors and they just invite a few friends around or something, people who you know that they're safe with, or they'll go to, you know, certain parties where they're, you know, they feel safe, it's the right environment. But for me it's been like, you know, out in the open for a long time, like walking around in London and stuff and doing things and making videos like that. So I think it goes beyond just like clothes or whatever, but it definitely shifts from time to time, you know. And I think like Contra did a video because he is the same sort of um, I suppose I have the same sort of understanding of it as Contra, really, where I don't know. At first, he was saying, "I've got to change my voice." You know, she thought that she'd have to change her voice and, you know, be softly speaking. But then after a bit, after like experimenting and just doing it, just being that way, acting that way. She's like, well, I like the sound of my voice, why, and it just comes down to like, one coming round to just accepting yourself for who you are, and I think that it's a wonderful thing when people can discover themselves in this way and just ignore these pundits who they don't know what they're talking about. They don't want to know. That's the thing, and that's what's. I suppose this could bring us back to the original topic of this video. The main topic is that like we can have apathy towards the right and wrong things. Like Trump is not something that we should be apathetic towards. We should care about it. We should criticize it. But like true tolerance to me, when it comes to people just trying to find out who they are and trying to come up with a language to understand that, be it in academia or the person next door, your neighbor, we can just be, true tolerance is apathy, where we know it's happening, but like we're just completely indifferent to it. We don't really care that someone over there in the restaurant is eating steak while we eat salmon. That's true tolerance. It's not putting up with something that you don't like. It's being completely indifferent to it. It's completely passive. There's a great philosopher called Glenn Newey, Newey. He sadly passed away, I think, at the end of last year in a boating accident. And yeah, I know. And he's done some great stuff. There is one video on YouTube of him doing a lecture about tolerance that I think everybody should watch. I posted it in one of the threads on my forum in an effort to expand a left-wing anarchist philosophical presence online, but it's mostly quiet. So if anyone wants to join and contribute, you're welcome to. But in that video, he describes like what tolerance is in terms of it being just apathy. In just like not care. There are some things that you can care about, but some things as regards like what people eat, what they do, what the religion, you can just be apathetic towards it. And apathy is this better term than using the word tolerance, which I think some people get mixed up with, like putting up with something even though you don't like it, or in which case it's sort of it's kind of paradoxical, in that you say you don't care about something, you don't like it, but you're putting up with it and you're okay with it. That's immediately going to lead to a conflict. Whereas if you just say tolerance is apathy, completely indifferent and passive towards whatever is going on over there, or it doesn't even register into consciousness as an issue. I think that's a better way of looking at it. But yeah, to me, gender is, for me, it's something much more transformative. I don't think that it's fixed for me, because to me, identity is something that's structured from the outside. Really, it's something we're built from the outside. We incorporate the world around us through a number of processes. And one of them is mimesis, which is where we copy other people's actions and behaviors, and we copy the way that we speak. Babies from a very young age, like hours or a few days, of being born, will mimic facial expressions of people, completely automatically. In which case, that's right from a very early age. We start to mimic the culture around us, and that's how we form our identity that way. Another way is through this Butler sort of performance. We learn by doing. We learn what we could call scripts. There's a great child psychologist called was it Judith Herman or Catherine Nelson? That's it. And she did several studies of this script behavior. And what a script is ways of acting that have certain desires and expectations built into them. So, this say you've got a dinner time scenario, there will be certain ways of talking and thinking that will apply only to the mother, and then certain ways of thinking and acting that will apply to the child and what comes next. So you have scripts for bedtime, scripts for going to the park and things like that. And this is all performative. It's just done over and over in a repetitive way until you sort of embody it. And then, of course, it becomes normative. It becomes a norm. It becomes something that we regard as normal. But within norms, you end up with, punishments and rewards. You get sanctions or benefits, which usually are very closely tied to status. And you're rewarded with status if you obey a norm. But if you go against the norm, then things can get slightly more aggressive with a minimum disagreement and bad luck, or it can be violence and what have you. And then, of course, it's just the general way in which we think of the way in which a human subject, the subject, is formed in society, a process that a French philosopher, Michel Foucault, calls subjectivation, which is the way in which the state forms a human being, which could otherwise be called a juridical subject, which is someone who embodies the law and acts in society according to those laws. But like laws and norms can be pretty much the same thing. And so it's being aware of how that all happens, understanding that in terms of the way that can affect gender, the way that it can affect the market, affect the self, and how pretty much everything that we do, that even the desires that we have probably been put there straight off the shelf from the culture around us, given how much we absorb all the time. And all these processes, especially mimesis and the scripts, that doesn't stop, at a certain age. That continues all the way through our entire lives,
All right. I'm going to interrupt you, John, because somebody
sure.
was asking for the child psychologist who did the...
Oh, yeah.
how to spell the name?
Catherine Nelson. So it's Catherine with a K. So KatherinE, and then Nelson, Nelson.
Right. And before we go too far, because I think that this, like you said, there's a lot here. I think we're gonna. I'm wondering if this what you're talking about, scripts, isn't part of the frustration that we see, because it seems like there's a script now in our government where Trump does the tweet thing that he does, and there is, the usual. So CNN gets their people together to talk, and MSNBC gets their people, and the BBC, and everybody else, Fox News gets their people, and it's just, and then the cycle keeps going. And at the same time as this is happening, they are literally warehousing children now and calling people animals. So it seems like, I guess it seems like there's this disconnect between just an endless words and talking and everybody sort of playing very predictable roles.
Yeah, they're very predictable. That's definitely a script. It's acting in a way that's just normal. It's usually highly uncontroversial, but like everyone's doing what's expected of them. It's just that the Trump thing, when he tweets what South Park equated to, texting while you're driving, in which case you shouldn't tweet while you're a president because it's just as dangerous, which I thought was brilliant. But yeah, it anticipates a certain way of acting. And I think something that you were on about earlier was important, and that is like that first moment when someone says something that's accusative. You have a moment where you just stop and you just breathe and you let it go for a moment, and then you ask some questions, I think that that same sort of mindful vigilance would be worthwhile in understanding that, the media is like a climate. It's like the weather. It wants to affect you. And some days I make a conscious choice to ignore the news, and I pick up a book and I find something completely irrelevant, because it seems to be the more that I follow it and it's something really negative, I start to feel misanthropic. I start to feel like all is lost, and but I know, I'm aware now that actually there's a component of that. That's what the media, that's the way the media works, like a storm. It works like the weather, and eventually it will change, and it'll be much more positive. I mean, it goes in with this view of we are in a world of acceleration. There's just everything just flits from one thing to the next, and it's really hard to keep up. It's hard to keep your attention there. And to concentrate on something for so long, because it just seems like everything becomes irrelevant so quickly. You get into something, right, and then the story's changed, and and that's all. I'm sure that when Trump or whoever it is tweeting those tweets, he knows how that affects people on the whole. That they require people to listen to them. They're like attention seekers. They want people to take notice and to react and to cause this media storm and frenzy, and I think people should have a bit more self-respect sometimes, and just not give this stuff credence. Most of the stuff that's give it any credence, especially when it's so heavily laden with like lowest common denominators and things.
And I think it's very complicated, because how is the average citizen supposed to know which is the bread and circus show and which is real? Like, I try to ground it in remembering, like, if I hear about children in warehouses, I think to myself, those are real people, and those people are going to grow up and they're going to have this memory in their heads forever. Like, this is going to be a part of who these people are forever, that ICE agents took them away from their parents and tossed them in a warehouse.
Yeah,
and that's never ever going to not be reality. So I think you have to just,
well, some stuff is rhetoric, some of it is coverage, and some of it is actual reporting objectively of what's going on in the world. And there's only like certain events that obviously you take note of, but a lot of it is just rhetoric. I remember watching the news for days on end a few years ago during the Libya conflict, and there really wasn't any change. Whereas when I watched it from time to time, it'd be like, it wouldn't be this steady plateau. It'd be this spike and catastrophe is about to happen. But if you watch it over time, it doesn't have that same effect as such. But yeah, I think one thing that helped me to sort of try, have a way of thinking that would sort of separate hype from, something worthwhile looking at was Aristotle's study of categorization of what rhetoric is. That there's three different types of rhetoric that look very similar to some of the fallacies that people point out a lot, like appeal to authority and things like that. But he basically says, there's logos, there's pathos, and there's ethos. And the logos, which is usually like another word for like logical discourse, for reasoning. This type of logos and rhetoric is just like using statistics in a really biased way, and then you got like pathos, which is just like provoking your emotions endlessly and antagonizing. And then there's ethos, which is like kind of like the argument from authority. I'm a doctor, believe me, or I'm a politician, believe me. And I think that if you can understand that categorization, that's the way that politics has been played for so long, even way back in the ancient Greeks, like where Aristotle's like commenting on older civilizations and his, You know, I think that helps, just having that way of being able to categorize events in the media, and finding another framework to look at it from, instead of just opposing viewpoints, having a framework in which to understand the world. And I remember this with the Christy Winters interview with the debate on the Skeptics Feminist channel with Sargon of Akkad, and she was just basically saying, sociology, look at these stats and everything, and they don't mean anything on their own. They're just like marks on the page. But you can have this framework called feminism that helps you to understand the implications of the things that you've recorded, and that was just something that Sargon wasn't capable of understanding. But the same goes for like an understanding of media, of media as something which has an effect on human nature in general. But yeah, there are things where, having understood those cautionary things, and being vigilant and understanding that those things are out there and how they work, people can begin to contribute more and to talk about these issues, and get good results, like the things that we were talking about earlier. So,
Well, we've been going for a couple hours. I actually think I think that this helped me.
Cool.
So we've won.
Yeah, me too.
So that's what's important.
Do it because you want to do it. Do it because you want to know, not because everyone else wants to know.
I wanted to one last thing for the chat.
Okay.
Because Faisal, I can't pronounce your name. Was saying about like how a lot depends on what they cover and what they don't cover. So for all the sort of negative stuff that you get, there was a KUPI, a meeting of female Muslims and female rights activists in Indonesia, and that led to a fatwa. I'm so sorry for my pronunciations, by the way, on child marriage, and nobody knows that, and nobody cares that happened. In the meantime, we still have child marriage in many parts of the States.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because there's again, it's what they cover. It tells a lot about the sort and why you can disregard a lot of the stuff that's out there, because in the middle of Syria, of all places, there is a rich feminist anarchist culture out there. There's if you go into Wikipedia and look up something called gyneology, it's a kind of study, their version of feminism over there, of understanding everything about the feminine and improving things in society. But you don't hear about this this great feminist rights movement that's in the middle of Syria, this incredibly war-torn place, with ISIS running rampant, and and being at war, and all the atrocities that are there. But yeah, this is why it's important to expand, what it is that you can look for. I mean, you can only see if you have the eyes to see. You can only look things up if you've got the terminology to work with. So
yeah, I think we're at a good place now, and we should quit while we're ahead.
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
But I think it has been great. It's been useful. I hope that the people in the chat and whoever listens to this later are gonna find it useful. I've put your channel in the description so that people can find it.
Great.
And if you want, you mentioned that the philosopher and his video that you on tolerance. If you give me a link for that, I'll add that in later on. And great. Thank you, everybody. And we're just going to sign off and say bye.
Bye-bye.